second day of the Provincetown Book Festival, and so excited to have this program. And I'm Nan Sonata, I'm the director of the Provincetown Book Festival. I once again get to introduce a member of the Festival Advisory Committee, and I don't know how we would do this without the Festival Advisory Committee. They have been so great. Well, starting with our godmother, Julia Glass, who was helpful from the very first year that we did this, incredibly helpful from the very first year we did this. But we have grown into a really wonderful group of, many of them alums of the book festival themselves, and it's a really wonderful working group. And that said, I'm going to introduce Chris Castellani, who is a wonderful novelist, and he is going to introduce this program.
Thank you, Nan, and thank you all so much for being here for Queer Histories, Violence, Race, Radicalization, Then and Now. The latest in this series of wonderful programs that I've had the honor of putting together. And of course, our committee could not do anything that we do without the wonderful Nan. So thank you, Nan, so much for putting this all together, and to the library for having us, and to our sponsors for putting this, for making it possible for travel and all sorts of other things. So thank you, Nan. So I am just going to read the bios of these two wonderful authors who will then take it from there. Hugh Ryan is a writer and curator, and most recently the author of The Women's House of Detention, A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison, which won the American Library Association's Stonewall Book Award for nonfiction. His first book, When Brooklyn Was Queer, won a New York City Book Award, was a New York Times Editor's Choice, and was a finalist for the Randy Schultz and Lambda Literary Awards. He has been honored with the Alan Berube Prize from the American Historical Association, multiple grants from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Duberman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, and residences at Yaddo and Watermill. He teaches in the MFA program at Bennington College. So welcome, Hugh. Prince Shakur is a Jamaican-American author, multi-medium artist, and educator. His writings have appeared in Teen Vogue, Afropunk, Catapult, Vice, and more on queer culture, film, and the inner lives of Black icons. His media work has been recognized by GLAAD and Society for Features Journalism. His debut memoir, When They Tell You to Be Good, has been described as, quote, a searing account of self-discovery in the face of structural oppression by Publishers Weekly, and is a Time magazine's most anticipated book of fall and best book of October. And we no longer have to anticipate it because it is here. And both works from both of these authors are available in the bookstore, and I highly encourage all of you to buy those books and books from the authors from the other sessions of the conference. Prince is the host of the Creative Hour podcast and is working on a forthcoming novel on which we wish you luck. Hugh and Prince.
Hello, everyone. I'll start. We were thinking of each reading a bit of our book for maybe like 10 minutes each, and then going into our discussion, and then having a cute little Q&A at the end, because you always need a Q&A. But yeah, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed being here in Provincetown. Kind of reminds me of a residency I did in Key West. Like, it's very cute. But yeah, I will read a bit from near the end of my book. So to describe it in my own words, I describe When They Tell You to Be Good as my political coming of age. So what it was like growing up queer and closeted in a Jamaican family that immigrated to the US, what it was like being radicalized by the Black Lives Matter movement in college, and then my travels abroad to the Philippines, France, a lot of different places. And a lot of it is also about me reckoning with different histories of patriarchal violence in my family. So yeah, this is near the end of the book, where I am in France for 3 months in 2018, because that's when I turned 24, and I learned that James Baldwin went to France when he was 24, so I was kind of like, I want to be like him. Yeah, so this is around page 242. June 30th marked the end of my second month in France and my birthday, which aligned with the birthdays of 2 other friends in the city. After cake, wine, liquor, finger foods, and gifts, we danced in their cleared dining room. I dangled onto Enzo and teased him playfully for playing too much Britney Spears. Leo arrived. We suckled each other's necks in an empty room. Leo and Enzo danced. I twirled with Leo's partner. In an entirely new and primordial way, I realized that I'd arrived to the exact place I'd always wanted to be. In someone else's world, smiling with their friends, making memories with them, and realizing it was all really just the process of falling in love. And falling in love proved to be the brave thing, one of the first life decisions that fully felt like mine. I might move past this story that I've had for myself, I thought. I can go to France and be more human. Maybe my aunt visiting tomorrow will not care when I tell her I'm gay. By the end of the night, the floor was sticky with beer and the party cleared. I trailed behind Enzo to his room, holding his hand the whole time. In his bedroom, we laid next to the open window. I closed my eyes and he held me. His warmth, which had anointed the entire day with safety, helped me realize that the adventure had changed. I had stumbled upon another home away from home, another place to rest my head. The dream in the back seat before Standing Rock, the paralyzing silence around my father's murder, the ice scraper held high by my mother, the dull thud on my brother's face as the scraper struck his coat, and the theater of being a black body abroad. All of it felt very far away. I wasn't living out this experience for Baldwin anymore. I had stolen something from his iteration of freedom. Baldwin had crafted a blueprint, and now I was crafting my own. And then there's a scene jump. Scene break. The days are mixed, or I mix them in my head to make it easier. My aunt arrives to France. It is a long walk to her hotel room. She hugs me warmly in her dim room where the blinds are shut. We take the train to Montmartre. I tell her stories about that spring and things about travel I have never told other family members. When she meets Enzo, she squeals with excitement and hugs him fiercely. I have to clutch at my chest to keep my heart from trying to jump out of it. Walking through Versailles Palace, Enzo holds my hand. My aunt laughs, her yellow dress fluttering in the breeze and sunlight. We eat ice cream and return to Paris on the train. My aunt takes photos of Enzo and me constantly. Her camera's eye becomes God's eyes. God's eyes are glistening down on us. Enzo must go home, so I stay with my aunt. I'm happy to finally be sharing this part of my world with someone who has known me my entire life. After 3 glasses of wine and long conversation, she stares at me and speaks. There's a lot you don't know about your father's death. She sighs, then continues. Honestly, the truth might make you hate a lot of people. The truth, I say? I try to study her face, but it is already shaded. We are already walking back to her hotel room. I remember to breathe in between steps, to not let the storm in my stomach reach my shielded expression. An hour later, my aunt is sleeping in her bed. I am holding myself so tightly that it feels like I may crush my own body. It is the only way to cry as violently as I am while staying almost completely silent. There is snot. My skin glistens like a seal, and I think my head may explode. The waves are crashing down. I am diving into Jamaica. All those questions about my father and the fact that all the silences lead me back to the very beginning. My mother's gaze moves through me darkly and towards a memory of her saying, "You laugh just like him sometimes, you know." The underlying tightness in her tone translates to, "You feel joy just like he did, and for that, maybe you can't be forgiven." I am a child trailing out of school behind my brother after some nameless bout of emotion has taken me. My brother leers up at me from the bottom of the stairwell in dismay and annoyance. He can't hear the caged bird trying to flutter out of my chest because I can't hear it either. The beating of the bird's wings is a wailing that has followed me my entire life. The same boy on the cement ledge during recess, or the bewildered boy staring back at my grandmother in Jamaica when I am 10. I am crying because I miss my mother, so my grandmother says, her tone like a viper, "Why are you crying? Did someone hurt you?" People only cry like that when someone is really hurting them. The same boy in the basement stricken to silence, or better yet, flailing out of the water. A black boy simply finding the justification to scream. even if it could kill him in the water or level a world. Then, I am 19 years old and fiddling with the radio in my grandmother's attic in Cleveland. She coughs, breathes, and admits that my father left it there while he was in prison. Again and again and again, while in the hotel room with my aunt, I realized that the secrets were the silence. The silence brought me into the world. 7 months later, the silence chased my father after he lunged out of a back seat. The silence took Dennis. The silence helped my mother escape working to know me. The silence took Crystal, but I hoped gave her bliss in whatever realm was next. In my grandmother's attic, as we stared at the silver radio, I realized that it wasn't just America that had tried to condition the silence into me, but it was also my family's trek for survival, which didn't have space for a boy that wanted to know more about his murdered father. Prison, I say. My grandmother realizes I did not know. I leave her house and curse myself for not asking to have the radio. I start to believe I can answer the questions. How do you lose something that you never really had? How do you miss someone that causes those that knew him to react to the mention of him with heavy sigh or fond laughter? Is it too much to hope to resurrect someone with your mind and heart? Do we get punished for playing God? Your memory gets in the way of my memory, is what the Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali once wrote. This means that I stumble upon some strange and unexpected truth about my father. The truth gives him weight. The weight coupled with the silence becomes unbearable. I am losing my father, then I am losing my father. Then on the bathroom floor, I am losing my father and my family all over again as the past meanders and explodes. And for the first time, I can see it differently. I bury the sleeve of my shirt in my mouth, and I try to text anyone that I can. How can I explain this other than I've explained it before? There's the boy in my second grade class. He is waving his hands over a dictionary. He rolls his eyes to the back of his head. He mutters, rolls them forward, and speaks. Your father is waiting in the cemetery, he says. He is angry. Thank you.
Ooh, that was good. Thank you, everybody. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I was thinking a lot this weekend about, in this time of like both book banning and plague, that to be together with so many people talking about so many different books right now is like just an absolute honor, and it has been so wonderful and welcoming here. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here, and particularly to everyone who organized this, and the library, and Nan, and it has just been a wonderful honor. So thank you all. I'm going to read a little bit from my most recent book, which is called The Women's House of Detention, which is the name of a 12-story maximum security prison that dominated Greenwich Village for most of the 20th century. I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction, and just the thing I want to say before I start is you can't talk about prisons honestly without talking about violence. Physical, sexual, spiritual, emotional, and all of that's going to come up in my reading, and pretty quickly too. So if for whatever reason on today of all days, you don't want to hear that, like I will not be offended. If you need to get up, you need to take out your phone, play with a fidget spinner, like, please take care of yourself. And then, hopefully in the discussion, we can ask some questions. So, this is the introduction, and it's called J. Toole Marks the Land. The Jefferson Market Garden in Greenwich Village is one of the loveliest places I can't stand. Flowering season seems to last longer there than the rest of the city. The low-rise nature of the surrounding buildings allows precious sun to warm the ground for Lenten roses in the first weeks of March, and keeps the garden inviting until the last of the camellias drop their petals in November. The only potential reminder of the spot's 150-year history as a prison is the high steel fence, which these days keeps the unwanted riffraff out rather than in. I used to love this garden. I'd sit by the koi pond, do interviews on my cell phone, and think what a beautiful oasis it was. What a gift the village had given the city. Now, I can't look at it without hearing J. Toole's voice describing the brutal physicals the doctors had inflicted upon her there, when the garden was a prison called the Women's House of Detention. When I go into the garden, I'm always brought back to the one time. It happened many, many times. But this one stands out. He's telling me to get up on the table and put my feet in the stirrups and this and that, and it felt like his whole arm went in there, you know? And they checked everywhere.
Every hole you have, that's where they went. And then he was like, all right, get up off the table. Hurry up, we gotta bring the next one in. Hurry up? I couldn't move. The pain was so bad, and I don't know what he did up in there, but it was so bad. And when I looked down, I was covered in blood. And they didn't do nothing. Today, it's hard to imagine that a prison once graced the rarefied streets of Greenwich Village, one of New York City's most picturesque and unaffordable neighborhoods. But for almost as long as there has been a Greenwich Village, which is to say, almost as long as there has been a United States, detention centers have been an integral part of village life. The last of them, the Women's House of Detention, stood from 1929 to 1974. It was one of the village's most famous landmarks, a meeting place for locals and a must-see site for adventurous tourists. And for tens of thousands of arrested women and trans-masculine people from every corner of the city, the House of D was a nexus, drawing the threads of their lives together in its dark and fearsome cells. Some were imprisoned there once, for as little as a day. Others returned often and were held for years at a time. For decades, upon their release, these women navigated the streets of Greenwich Village, ate in its automats and diners, caroused in the bars that would let them in, lived in nearby tenements or slept rough in the parks, worked what jobs would hire them, attended court-mandated health screenings and probation meetings, and in 1,000,001 other ways, made the village their own. Now, aside from a small plaque on the garden's fence, they've been almost entirely forgotten. Almost. The slim few who have fought to preserve the memory of the House of D are mostly working-class lesbian and bisexual women and trans-masculine folks, the people most likely to fall into its clutches and least likely to have other landmarks to call their own. Jay Toole first ended up in the orbit of the House of D when she was 13 in 1960. Some friends had given her the haircut every cool boy wanted, a tight fade flat top, just like Steve McQueen and Mickey Mantle. Well, that was the final straw for her father, a violent, sexually abusive man who ruled their Bronx home with his fists. That night he threw her out, and Jay lived among the queer kids on the streets of the village for the next 25 years. At the age when most of her peers started high school, Jay started heroin. In 1964, she stole a taxi to drive her girlfriend to California, but they only made it as far as Texas before they were caught, and Jay was sentenced to her first bid in the House of D. A lot of us called it the playground. A lot of us called it a prison. I called it both, Jay told historians in 2016, depending on what I was arrested for and how much I got. For Jay, the prison was complicated. Dangerous, vile, violent, dirty, cruel, but also a place where she met other queer people and one of the centers of her queer community. She and the other butches would hang out in the shadow of the prison at Wayland's drugstore on 6th Avenue, where they could watch the tide of arrested women flow in and out of the prison's high stone walls. Most of the people she met in prison are gone now, dead or just disappeared. But Jay keeps their memories alive. Since the early 2000s, she's organized tours of the West Village to share the queer history of the House of D because young people don't know about it anymore. The landmark is gone, but she marks the land, exposing the grim roots beneath the garden's manicured paths. And make no mistake, the House of D was a queer landmark. In truth, all prisons are, especially ones intended for women. Today in America, approximately 40% of people incarcerated in women's detention facilities are part of the broad queer spectrum, compared to about 3.5% of the general population. That statistic is based on in-person interviews with over 100,000 currently detained people. And researchers only identified someone as a sexual minority if they themselves identified that way in an in-person interview in prison with a stranger. We can only speculate how high the percentage would have been had the study counted those who could not talk openly about their sexual identities. We live in the age of mass incarceration. If we extrapolate these findings to the nearly 250,000 women currently incarcerated in America today, at least 100,000 are queer. And that's after decades of LGBTQ, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-prison activism, which have supposedly made our criminal legal system more fair. During the years the House of D was active, which spanned the single most homophobic period in American history, the percentage of queer people it kept encaged was almost certainly higher. How much higher, we'll never know for sure. But records show that queer women and trans masculine people were sentenced to the House of D for such crimes as smoking, wearing pants, sending the definition of the word lesbian through the mail, attempting suicide, being abandoned by their parents, accepting a ride from a man at night, walking on the streets, drug addiction, waywardism, running away from abusive parents, disobedience, drug addiction, being raped, and lesbianism itself. Yet the impacts of queer people on prison history and the impacts of prisons on queer history are rarely examined. And even when they are, the focus is mostly on men. But the House of D, more than perhaps any other prison, had an outsized role in queer life. It sat at the end of Christopher Street, the block whose very name is a global byword for queerness. You could see the Stonewall Inn from the prison's high, small windows. And during the Stonewall Uprising, those on the inside held a riot all their own, setting fire to their belongings and tossing them out the windows while screaming, "Gay rights, gay rights, gay rights." Yet still, in 2016, the New York Times would refer to the Stonewall Uprising as being all gay men, and only grudgingly issue a correction stating there was, and this is a quote, "at least one lesbian involved." One, that's all you get. J. Toole, a Stonewall vet herself, could have told them that if only anyone had bothered to ask. The House of D helped make Greenwich Village queer, and the village, in return, defined queerness for America. No other prison has played such a significant role in our history, particularly for working class women and trans masculine people. For them, as pioneering historian Joan Nessel, founder of the Lesbian History Archives, once wrote, the House of D was, quote, "a constant presence in our lives, a warning, a beacon, a reminder, and a moment of community." I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
I'll go first. I've been waiting to read that book, so even just hearing it now, because I've been reading When Brooklyn Was Queer, it's so cinematic. Oh my! And I feel like even hearing that, I have so many questions. But I guess to start, what was kind of brought to the surface for you when writing about this women's prison in terms of the connection between like queerness and carcerality? Because I know you unpacked a lot there, but I guess like what came to the surface for you that you didn't realize or couldn't have anticipated would have come to the surface in the process of researching and writing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because so many things actually came to the surface. I think the biggest one for me though is that I was raised, a liberal Democrat in a union family and like, went to lefty places and had a lefty life and would have, before I started writing this, told you that the prison system was bad. I might even have described it as broken, But now, looking at it historically, I actually think the prison system is incredibly efficient. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is doing what it has always done, which is to hide and oppress every social system that we refuse to deal with. One of the things that brought me into writing this book, I had met J. Toole. We've known each other for many years, and I'd gone on her tours of the West Village, so I knew a little about the House of D. But when I started to do the research to ask myself, am I looking at like an interview with Jay about this prison, or am I looking at like a book about a history? I was doing some researching, and one of the first things I found is that statistic that 40% of people incarcerated in women's prisons today identify as LGBTQ. 40%, right? There is a crisis of incarceration that is happening among queer people in America today that we simply have never talked about. And so when I started to look into this and to peel backwards on that idea of like, what are prisons doing? the biggest thing that jumped out to me is that they have always been intended to lock up queer women and transmasculine people. I mean, gender nonconforming people in general, but like literally after the Civil War, America built a system of incarceration that focused on women who were gender nonconforming because they were seen as an economic threat to America. There were only 3 things a woman could be in America in the late 1800s. You could be a wife, or you could be a teacher, right? Or you could be a prostitute. And the line between those things was proper femininity. The properly feminine woman could be a wife or a teacher eventually, and therefore would not upend on the streets. The woman who was not properly feminine, whether she was too sexual, whether she was too masculine, whether she was black, because you had to be white to be properly feminine this time, right? Those women would end up on the streets and end up prostitutes. So we built an entire system of incarceration for women that arrested them at younger ages for things that were not considered crimes when men did them in order to indoctrinate them into this kind of forced feminization. And that is the thing that I have walked away from most with this book, is an understanding that our prison system never did anything like what I ever thought it was doing. Had nothing to do with justice, but particularly for folks, assigned female at birth, it was a homophobic, transphobic process of forced feminization that is still operating today.
And follow-up question, were there certain texts or research materials that you pulled from heavily? Because, I don't know, even hearing that excerpt, I was thinking of, I can't remember the name of the book by Angela Davis, but it's about, like, basically carcerality and womanhood and how both of those things are mixed together. So I guess I'm wondering what you kind of pulled from.
I mean, so much of her work is that she was in the Women's House of Detention. That's the only prison she was ever held in where she was in the general population. And in her autobiography, yeah, she even writes in her autobiography that this was the first time she had ever come to think about the role of prisons, not as just political because they arrested political prisoners, but as in fact the linchpin for racism in America as a way of social control. But the texts that were actually most important, really surprisingly, I spent the first year of research just asking myself whether I could write this book, because there's not a lot out there from the point of view of formerly incarcerated queer women in 1937. Surprisingly, I know, you're all sitting here thinking, of course, there's so much. So I spent a year doing this research, first looking at the major queer organizations that existed in those times, the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis and places like that, and I didn't find a lot. And I looked at the archives that I had used for When Brooklyn Was Queer, these historical figures who were famous, whose correspondence was saved, and again, not a lot. They would mention things, but they didn't really talk about it, right? And nothing really from the perspective of the people who had been incarcerated. And I stopped for a while. I was like, oh, maybe the reason no one has written this book is actually this book cannot be written in a good way. And I went back to a lot of other historians, and particularly Saadia Hartman was so important for me in understanding how to actually do this work, because she has a process of critical fabulation, which she imagines into the places that the archive cannot tell us about, right? The places there are no records for. She particularly was talking about the experiences of black women on the ships of the Middle Passage coming from Africa to America, the Caribbean, South America. But I was sort of using this as a way to, I didn't feel I could critically fabulate my way into the lives of these incarcerated people and write about them, but I thought if I can imagine the life of the person who passes through the prison, I can imagine the place in which their life will hit power in such a way that they will end up in the archives. Because you only end up in the archive if you have power. Either you have power and you get to write your own story, or someone has power over you and you're the raw material for their entry into the story. So prisons are one sense of that. But I thought, where else would these people interact with power in a way that their stories might get captured? And I, in that moment, immediately understood where I needed to look, because my first job in New York City was as a social worker with queer homeless youth. And I knew the kind of records that our social workers kept. I had letters from these students and from their parents, and I had their transcripts and their health records. And I knew if there were social workers in New York, because this system really understood poor women and queer women as an economic threat, I knew if I could find social work records from that period, they would be talking about the things I wanted to talk about. And I found this organization called the Women's Prison Association, still around today, still doing work with formerly incarcerated women in New York. And they had an archive at the New York Public Library, hundreds of boxes of case studies that became the center of this book. And when I reached out to them for permission to look at them, no one had ever looked at them. They've been in the library since the 1980s. No one has ever once looked at them. And they said to me, you are welcome to look at them, but we don't think you're going to find anything queer in there. We just weren't asking those questions at that time, you know? And I was like, this happens all the time if you're doing research. People will be like, I don't know anything. And you have to just be like, I'm sure you are right, but could I look? Like, please let me look. And within the first day, sitting down those archives, I found a 400-page file that followed a young butch woman from her first arrest when she was about 17 years old for hitchhiking in 1936, where she explained to the social worker that she had never thought anything wrong about who she was. It was not her fault that other women looked up to her as they would a dazzling football hero. That's just who she was. And it followed her whole life. It followed her through World War II. She kept in touch with these social workers long after she had left New York. It was the kind of file that you never see, the records that you never, ever encounter, that we all imagine, I think, when we're historians are out there, but don't actually get to look at. And then I spent years just digging through those files for more of these stories and found literally thousands of them. It's incredible. Probably about 75% of the people in the House of D were queer. That's statistics comes from both incarcerated people and from psychiatrists working there. 75% while it was operative. So these stories were mostly queer stories. But I'm really curious, so as a historian, like, I will spend my entire life in an archive happily, like, the books are just an excuse for me to look through the paperwork. But I often find myself wondering, what is the use of history right now, particularly in this moment that we are in where it feels like the world is ending, you know, like we can barely make it through tomorrow, why are we thinking about yesterday? When I read your book, I was so enthralled by the number and kinds and ways of different history you bring in. Personal history, national history, books, movies, even sort of mythological history with the figure of the duppy. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit, as someone who is writing a political memoir right now, what do you see as the role of history both in your work and also in kind of the larger struggle we're in?
Yeah, thank you. I think in my work, I wanted to write a memoir because, I don't know, I got radicalized in high school and college, and a lot of that was kind of understanding, there are all these social conditions and historical conditions that literally make the life that I live as like an inner city Black kid in Cleveland, child of immigrants that came here in the 80s. And so I think being radicalized made history so important to me on like a intrapersonal level, a social level, like a storytelling level. And then in college and after college, I was reading a lot of Black Power literature, a lot of Black Panther Party literature, because I was kind of developing my ideas around being an anarchist and Black. And I was just reading a lot of men who were like misogynistic or had been locked up and were traumatized because of it, or just like all these social ills that I feel like a lot of queer people try to avoid, not always successful. And so I really was just thinking, like, if I can't even find this during that time period, and I'm existing in a period of history right now where Black radical action is kind of so important and is being materialized in this new way, like, I have literal life experience in these arenas. And so on a personal level, it was kind of like, I want to write something that I wish existed, which is the combination of all these like identities and life experiences that I have. But on a larger level, I think history is kind of the battleground of human culture. Like, to your point, it's like people with power get to determine and dictate what history is. But how do queer people, how do undocumented people, how do immigrants show up in the historical record? And I feel like even writing this, like, I had a lot of challenges trying to write about my family. And so I did kind of reference Saidiya Hartman too, because a lot of the men in my family were in jail or came back and had somebody's name. Like, my dad's name for the last number of years of his life in the US was Vernon Petty. And I didn't know that until like around the time I was writing this book. And so I think on a larger level, it's just important that we do the work so that there's even the possibility of these like histories and existences and realities to be present in the future, because I think that's one part of a larger process of liberation, where it's like, I'd love for there to be a future where people like me or like us are even more free than we can even imagine right now. And I think understanding history clearly opens up that possibility in a way that not knowing that history, it wouldn't be as possible.
I'm curious. So we both talked about Hartman. Who were the other people who radicalized you, and particularly because of the audience that were in the other books? Like, what were the ones that you sort of think like my book wouldn't exactly exist the way it is without these other texts?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I would say definitely Angela Davis's biography. I would definitely say Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton. Heavy by Kiese Layman. Autobiography of Malcolm X. Elaine Brown wrote a really amazing memoir. I think it's called A Taste of Power, or I can't remember the exact name, but
It is, yeah.
okay. And she goes in on some of the men in the Black Panther Party. So I feel like I really like texts that allowed a sort of critical lens towards masculinity in a way that I think the books written by men don't necessarily do. And I mean, it's a really troubling and disturbing read, but I also I read Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, and I was just kind of like throwing up in my mouth, but also thinking like, okay, this person thinks he's being rational, or maybe not. And so I think even that gave me some frameworks of how to, I don't know, look at masculinity on like a sort of, I guess, like bird's eye level. And I mean, this isn't really like a book that's out there, but while I was writing this book, a lot of it was about wanting to learn more about my father's murder in 1995, shortly after I was born. And the part that I read where my aunt basically says, like, there's a lot you don't know about your father's murder, it'll make you hate people. And what I essentially found out was that my father was murdered in 1995. He had a brother named Cedric Murray, who was his younger brother, and that brother, because of my father's abuse against my mother and my mother defending herself this one particular time, he believed that my mother's side of the family was implicated in my father's murder, and he murdered two of my mother's brothers. And I learned this, it was deeply disturbing, but then I started researching him, and I found out that he had a diary that was found on him when he was killed. And I saw it in some articles, and I was like, I gotta find this diary. And I eventually did after like a year and a half of searching. And so I consider that like a text that changed basically the trajectory of the book, because essentially I was writing about how I came of age as a radical Black queer person into being a writer. And here's this gangster hired killer who also wrote and wanted to write a book about his life. So it became, how do I merge these two kind of histories, I guess, as well.
That's such a, like, to me, like a marginalized or queer experience, that hunting for a text and then finding it. I think the panel that was here this morning was talking about that, about the books that we wish we had access to when we were younger, whether they're diaries or and it is so true, though. You find that story and it can really like radicalize you and change the whole direction of your project.
And my next question is kind of also about research, but how do you approach who you want to talk to, what to include? Like, how do you find the characters of the books that you're writing?
It's funny, I'm really slow. Very, very, very slow. It takes years of just swimming in the information. Like, that's what I think of it as. Like, I try to immerse myself in the world and the time that I'm writing about, the files that I'm writing about. I'll read them over and over again. I will read novels from that time. I'll read newspapers from that time. I just try to like get a sense of what I'm talking about and thinking about and live in it. And then I build all of these different like ways of kind of visualizing the data. Usually there's a big timeline that everything goes into, but I'll also map it all around the city, or I'll cluster it around people and make social networking maps. And I'm just trying to like lay the data out in different ways until I start to see things, patterns or trends. And then once I get that, I then go back in and figure out who can best show that trend. So basically when I was writing this book, I was reading these thousands and thousands of case files. And as I was putting them together, I would start to notice things. One really big one, in the 1940s, we start to see all of these drug arrests, and they really escalate in the 50s. They just don't exist before then, basically. And so I knew something was happening here that I would have to understand more of, that the files couldn't tell me, right? I would have to understand something about drug law, or maybe something about the women and drugs, something about drugs here. And in 1956, all of a sudden this strange clinic opens up inside the prison, and it was dispensing pills of some kind. So I was like, okay, I've got to figure out what this means. It turned out to be Thorazine. And so there are all of these moments, once I have it in that kind of arrangement, that I can start to say to myself, like, these are the stories I will need to be able to tell. And then I go back to the mass of files I looked at. So I look at 1,000 files that tell me I have to talk about drugs in the 50s. Well, then I do the research on drugs in the 50s to understand what's happening. Then I go back to those 1,000 files and say, who here can walk me through this the best, right? Because I think I at least need a human. I need people and life, and I need to understand it's not just like theoretical. And so then I will like look through all of the folks whose files I have saved and say like, who best captures this experience, and I'll use them as kind of the main body to walk us through that history, and then as other, no one person can capture all of that experience. So a lot of the drug war in my book is told through the experiences of Big Cliff Trondle, who was a trans guy in the early 1900s who was arrested for wearing pants in Brooklyn in 1913, and was let go by the first judge who he was brought in front of because the judge said, this is not a crime. Unfortunately, his social worker immediately rearrested him to get a new judge and use a new accusation, and he was sentenced to 3 years in jail, where he then became a heroin addict. And so then he spends the rest of his life in and out of jail, mostly over heroin, but not exclusively. And he can tell a lot of the story of the drug war through following him. But what he couldn't talk about as a white transmasculine person was the experience of a lot of the black women who were passing through the jail at the same time, who were being accused of drug use and being completely denied services, whereas he was a drug user and spoke to them about drug use, but was being given services because, in large part, he was both white and from a somewhat upper class or middle class background, and he wanted to stop being transmasculine. That's really the reason they give him services. So he could tell part of the story, and he walks us through a lot of the chapter. But I then have to bring in a bunch of other women who are experiencing a very different, but also pretty common experience of that time of just being completely denied services because they were black lesbians who were implicated in heroin, or mostly heroin at that point. So it's like this constant contraction and expansion. I'm looking at the mass and then trying to find the one person to walk us through it, and then going back to the mass of people. And it's kind of the same process for all of my history. So I spend like 5 years researching to 1 year writing. And your book, so this is something I was curious about, because your book is a memoir, but it is not told chronologically. And how did you find the structure to tell your story?
Originally, I wrote it chronologically, and I was going to write it from birth until now. And then I was like, people don't care about everything. There was like a middle school chapter I took out because I was like, this is just too sad. I went to Our Lady of Peace. No one needs to know this. And I don't know. But originally, it was chronological, and I think the way that I was orienting it was looking at like themes and what parts of my life embodied certain themes. So like one was like critical lens at masculinity. Another one was this notion of like queer displacement. So what happens to a queer person when they're cast out from their home emotionally or physically, or the variety of forms that people can be cast out. Also about kind of like there's a line in the excerpt I read, but missing something that you've never really had. And that can be numerous things, like a father or a family that really gets you or gets you in a certain way. And so I originally wrote it chronologically, and I knew there were certain things I had to include, like I had to put in a chapter about Standing Rock. I had to put in a few chapters about my travels abroad and dealing with anti-blackness. I had to kind of paint a structural and a personal portrait of Jamaica. And so there's that chapter when I end up going to kindergarten for a year in Jamaica. So those were kind of the bigger pillars. And then the writer Hanif Abdurraqib, who's also from Ohio, I'd written a few essays under him as a freelance writer, and he approached me because he got a job at Tin House and was like, send me your book. And Tin House had already rejected it, and I was like, if you want to read it, you can. But and then he liked it and offered me a contract. And I mean, I don't know if a lot of you have read his work, but he's just like a really amazing music and cultural writer. And I knew working with him, I was like, whatever you want to suggest, I'll listen. Yeah, and so he just had very good suggestions and feedback, and one of the biggest ones he said immediately, he was like, I want to turn this into sections of mini memoirs. I think it could work really well non-chronologically, so take some time and consider that and think about the ways that the chapters could be arranged alongside each other differently. And so I did all these like outlines of like different chapters, and there's one section I kind of consider about, it's kind of about bodily autonomy and intimacy. There's another section where like the later sections I think are just me reckoning with these like patriarchal and cultural histories. And so each of the sections represent something kind of different to me. And then it became like, how do we situate this in time and place since it's non-chronological? So then the chapter titles became really important. And then finding my uncle's diary. And for a while I was like, oh, I'll put it at the beginning, or I'll put an entry in between each chapter. And then that kind of, I felt like took it out of context. And so it felt important to put his diary pages alongside my own reckonings with Cedric's life and my father's life. And so moving it out of order then made it important to figure out how to introduce people differently, because like my best friend is like brought in like in the first chapter, but in the original draft she was introduced in like chapter 6, and so a lot of it was kind of, how do I make some of the things here make sense now that it's out of order? And then I feel like having it out of order gave me some freedom, and so the last chapter of the book is autofiction, but it's not really noted in the book that it's autofiction. So I've also had a lot of events where people are like, how's your dad doing? And I'm like, he died in 1995. So yeah, those are some of the choices that went into it. Yeah.
Shall we see if anyone here, it's about noon, so maybe we'll open it up to the audience?
Yeah, Q&A. Any questions? Yeah.
Both are dealing a lot with a lot of violence. And I wanted to know your feelings about how you describe violence, and I don't know. I just talk about what you went through to write what you did.
Well, I'll say for me, you cannot talk about prisons without talking about violence. And so one thing that was really important to me when talking about it was to be honest about it, but also to contain it in a sense. I think it can be really easy to turn talking and advocating around marginalized experiences, particularly if they're not yours, into like a trauma porn situation. And I'm not interested in that. I don't think that's good for anyone. So when I talk about violence, it's very much in terms of who perpetrated this. There's never just free-floating violence, you know? It's always pinned to, these are the structures that made it possible, these are the ways it was hidden up and covered, and these are the ways people survived it and what they did afterwards, and these are the people who were lost to it and who did not survive, right? I want to show that violence isn't our origin story. It doesn't make us, even if it is constitutional to us. It's something we pass through, and it's something that is done to us, right? It's not just that it happens in prison, right? We always talk about prisons with this like passive agency of things happening. And I'm like, no, people did that, right? There are specific people who did these things, and they need to be held accountable, even if the only accounting we can do 100 years later is to name them. So for me, that's a lot of what I think about. Violence can never just sit there. It can never take over. It can never obliterate the person I'm writing about, but it also can't be ignored.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I think for me, I knew I wanted to write a book about coming out and then like living in this gray area with your family where I come home from college for winter break and my mother's like, don't do that gay shit here. And I'm like, oh my God, that's literally who I am. And so I think on a certain level, that was a violence I wanted to approach and to like make very concrete and material, because I was just very tired of coming out narratives where it's either your family hates you and they beat you up and you're kicked out of the house, or they're totally accepting. Like my family is very much in a gray area that I'm still constantly negotiating. So that was kind of one violence that I wanted to speak to that I felt like I hadn't really read very intensely. But then in dealing with like the other forms of violence in the book, even if it was like things that I experienced from my family, or like in a social movement space, like when I was in Standing Rock, I had this jacket that said "Fuck White America" at the time, and I don't know, I was just like very wanting to, I don't know, it was just like that period of time where I was like, I hate everything. And I had like some indigenous men follow me and like threaten me when I was there. And so it's like, that's even a moment where it's like, depending on how you view it, it's like I'm committing an act of aggression or other people are towards me. But I think on any level, I wanted to look at the systems that created the different kinds of violences that I'd experienced. So with my family, I wanted to look at the economic conditions of Jamaica and what led my family to immigrate, but also like kind of understand the evangelical, like missionary communities that came to the island, or with Standing Rock, like I was in this social movement space, but I wanted to do my due diligence and like contextualize the movement in a way that was outside of some of my personal feelings. And then I think especially with family and things that my family have experienced, I do talk a lot about the traumatic things that have happened, but I also wanted to set certain boundaries. And so I knew that my dad was abusive to my mother, but I didn't want to go into extreme detail or be super explicit about that. But I wanted to acknowledge how his violence towards her affected how she raised me, which was like, even though I'm gay, she still would say to me, like, you're gonna beat women when you grow up. And I'm like, I'm gay. I mean, anyone can beat anyone up, but I'm gay. And so I think it was just kind of understanding that there is a root cause for many of these things that I've experienced in my life, and being honest about that, and also trying to get at the sort of visceralness of being an organizer, being in these social movement spaces, and reading a lot of texts where like militant people like lionize themselves, and they're like, I slung my gun around and I fought 10 police officers, and there's no fear in a lot of what they write, or the fear comes afterwards. And I wanted to write about what does it mean to literally be watching police and state officials sweep through an indigenous camp, beating people up right in front of you. You can't find your friends. You're worried they might be arrested. I'm scared. And what does it mean to write about that in my body? Because I think part of bravery is still acting anyway in the face of that violence. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to commend this panel. You were great, and the questions were good. I love Hugh's book, and I can't wait to read yours. So my question now is, what are your current projects? What are you working on?
I try to make a lot of content online about being a writer and the weirdness. So I make a lot of videos about like the author process. I run a podcast where I interview other artists. But writing-wise, I've been working on a novel. I wrote it in college in 2014, and I didn't look at it again. And then when the lockdown happened, I was just like, I've been writing so much creative nonfiction, and I want to try my hand at fiction. So I've been rewriting that since then. And that's basically about a black boy growing up in the South, kind of against the backdrop of the AIDS crisis. So some of it is in the South, some of it is in New York, some of it is in a jail that he jailbreaks out of. And so I've been working on that pretty heavily. I'm on draft 9, and I'm also working towards like two different collections of essays. One is kind of looking critically at different black men throughout the diaspora, like Huey P. Newton, James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, Kouassi Balagoon, who's a really famous new African anarchist who was one of the people to help free Assata Shakur from prison. And then I'm also like kind of working towards another collection that's all about Baldwin, since I've been to France, and last summer I spent a month in Saint-Paul-de-Vence where he lived for 17 years. So a lot of different things, and I also like film, so I'm working on a screenplay, so a lot of different things.
Last week, actually, I just sold my next book, which is going to be a collection of essays. And it's going to be sort of a memoir in essays about the 90s and early aughts and queer history and yeah, I got to write it now. That's the hard part. And then that sort of emerged because I am like 2 years into a, I don't know, maybe 7-year research project on the queer history of the East Village. And that's mostly being done. For the first time, I'm working mostly with living people instead of paper archives. So I've been interviewing like folks who were involved in the avant-garde scene in the East Village in the 80s, and folks who grew up there in the 60s, and just trying to get, like, all of my work kind of looks at queer history through an urban sort of materialist lens. Like, how do neighborhoods function? How does government policy function? One of the weird random things that I've discovered in this is that a foundational part of the sort of like East Village becoming this like radical neighborhood post-World War II is that it's the first neighborhood in Manhattan to lose population in the 20th century. Everything else is growing until the 60s, right? We hit the 60s, New York starts to lose population for the first time since the 1600s. Except in the East Village. The Lower East Side had such a high proportion of Jewish communities from Eastern Europe that when they passed a quota law in 1926 restricting specifically those communities, that area of the city lost 200,000 people in 2 decades, leaving an empty neighborhood in the middle of Manhattan. So when post-World War II, there's all of this economic pressure to kind of break up the family farms that had been Puerto Rico's economy for so long and force the folks who owned those lands into sharecropping situations, which then forced them, of course, to come to the US to work in manufacturing, which was the goal. They all moved to the Lower East Side because that neighborhood was available, right? So it's these kinds of like, it takes me like 10 years to figure out all of these pieces and then find the people that I can tell the story through. So I am somewhere in that deep process, and I hope that like 5 years from now I can tell you about the book.
Thank you.
Pink shirt.
So a fact versus fiction question that I want to position a little differently for both of you. So you mentioned in passing that your last chapter is fictionalized. What I'm more curious about is through the memoir, as opposed to an autobiography, how do you decide where to stick with fact and where to embellish or go into fiction? On your side, interviewing dead people, as it were. If you reach, I've got a story here and I've got a story here and I got a hole, are you the type to say, I'll bridge that in what I think was rational? Or do you say, there's a hole and I'm leaving the hole?
That's another good question. I mean, with memoir, I think you have a lot more creative license. It's like, I definitely don't want to pull, like, what was that book, A Million Little Pieces, where the guy was on Oprah and then he ended up lying and then she brought him back to, like, basically, like, beat his ass on TV. So I wanted to avoid that. But I think with creative nonfiction, what I really enjoy is that, like, if I try really hard, I can write about the same event in 3 different ways. It's just the lens. And so a lot of like the fact versus fiction thing to me is like interpretation. And I think if I'm interpreting an event honestly, even if it isn't totally beholden to like the truth or what factually happened, like emotions are still real as well. And then when to veer from fact more into fiction, I dealt with that a lot more in the last parts of the book where I was writing about my father and his brother and then these other uncles on my mother's side of the family that were murdered. And a lot of that was trying to find like record of like events that, like things that happened throughout Jamaica's history that they witnessed or I could learn that they'd witnessed. Like one example is like in my uncle's Cedric Murray's diary, he notes like basically narrowly escaping the police on this particular date, and I was able to figure out from his diary and other research that he was in Tivoli Gardens when there was this huge police raid there. And so that was kind of me merging like his interpretation of history with like the sort of historical record. And then with like choosing to do autofiction near the end, I very seriously kind of wanted to reach some kind of conclusion about my father's murder. And I realized throughout the book, like, oh, I've been searching my whole life for all these answers from other people, but essentially the best answer that I can find about my grief is the answer I can give myself, which is he was a horrible person in a lot of ways, but he's someone that I will always miss. And so how do I fictionalize a confrontation that allows that reality, that understanding to reach a sort of climatic point? And I mean, I consider that last chapter the best writing I've ever done because it happened in an hour. I haven't changed a word of it since, and it makes the most sense out of anything I've ever written. And so in that sense, I'm kind of like, it's kind of like a fact or a reality that I gave myself that no one else could.
That's great. I think in this kind of work, in these histories, I am very pinned to facts. If I can't kind of like point to something specific, I don't generally talk about it. It's somewhat different when I'm doing more interpretive essay work, where I feel I can be a little looser, but I think the furthest I get away, I do speculate occasionally. So there's a woman who I follow in the 50s named Honora, who is the like only daughter of an upper middle class black family from Queens who live in this very fancy neighborhood known as Adderley Park. And she is a computer programmer and cabaret singer, and she's been out since she was 16. You know, she was dating women in the fancy summer camp that she's sent to by her family, and they, of course, you know, don't listen and don't accept it. And she ends up dating this foreman of a toy factory named Rocky, who's like this like young blonde butch who's much younger than her, and everyone's a little scandalized. And they have these like exciting adventures together. They have this like great, you know, life. But in the end, she's like, we're just different. She's like, I want to talk about the opera and I don't want to go bowling every night. You know, like they're having some real butch femme problems is basically what's happening. And so they break up and they get back together. They break up and they get back together. And then one night, Nora comes into the social work agency and she says she had been arrested after she and Rocky broke up at one point. She was like, yeah, this cop came up to me and offered $8 to have sex with him. So of course I did it. No one abducted me into prostitution. Please, the cops push you into it. So that's how she ends up with the social workers. And she comes in and she's been, you know, having these frustrations with Rocky, and she says, I saw this poster organizing a homosexual lecture. I think I'm gonna go. And that poster is actually very famous. The Mattachine Society in 1955, this guy named Randy Wicker decided that they weren't doing the right things, that they were not promoting themselves publicly. They were a secret, like, membership-based organization that was never going to have any political clout if they did not reach out. And so he was like, give me one shot. We're going to have this one public meeting. Let me advertise. And Honora is one of the people who saw those posters and ended up going. And after that, she really falls off from the social work records. She kind of gets her life organized outside of it. She comes in, she doesn't tell them a lot, and she ends up meeting a woman, and they sort of end up together, but they don't know a lot about it. And I allow myself there to speculate a little bit that maybe she got involved. That meeting of the Mattachine Society is also where the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis starts, the lesbian organization. And so I speculate that I think she probably got involved. We can have almost no information about those early membership rolls, right? They were destroyed, they were full of pseudonyms. I did as much searching as I could to see if there was anything about like a young black cabaret singer, but I just never found anything. But I mark it as speculation. I always say, like, this is me wondering if maybe this got happened, you know? That's pretty important for me in this work because I think so often these kinds of histories we are told they do not exist. That they are made up or exaggerated, that we cannot trust these people, right? And so I'm always worried that any mistakes in my work will be taken by someone who has an agenda to sort of like destroy the rest of it. And so, although I don't think by any means that it is the only way to work this kind of story, it's where I feel most comfortable. Time maybe for one more?
When a book is published, you send it out into the world, kind of like a child. But you still have hopes for it. And I'm just curious, what are your hopes for your books? What do you hope they'll do out there in the world?
This question always makes me want to cry. I hope it helps people that are like me or aren't like me survive this world a little bit better or a little more gracefully or a little more with like righteous anger. Like I feel like a lot of this book, I kind of consider it an act of revenge against all of the times that people in my family or other people in my life were like, don't do this or don't do that or don't be gay or don't live your life in the way that you do. And I loved, like, there's this Ocean Vuong quote where he did this interview at The Strand and he talks about how queer people learn through failure. And so I also hope that, like, at least this book gives people permission to fail spectacularly and still live anyway. And then I hope with, like, my body of work, I just want to encourage people to think and look at the world radically and act. And so I feel like a big tenet of how I want to approach storytelling is telling radical narratives.
I think for me, growing up at a time where like there was no discussion of anything queer where I was at all, like I can remember learning to use the card catalog in my local library at like 9 because I wanted to look up homosexuals, and the only place I found them was in a book about Greek and Roman statuary. That was it. That was the entirety of what was in that library, you know. And the world rarely made any sense to me. I often felt like I I was like I don't understand anything. I don't understand anything. Everything I think seems to have nothing to do with what I am told is real, and so therefore what am I, right? And so a lot of my work, I think, has been about trying to understand the conditions under which like LGBTQ people live right now, and it's history, but I often think of it as like what I'm actually trying to do is chart the direction and flight path of an arrow, right? I'm not exactly interested in the past, but it's the only way I have of understanding what's going to happen next. And so my work generally looks at these kinds of questions of like, what does it mean to live in a society where so many people are imprisoned? And what does it mean for queer people specifically, right? And what are the ramifications? For so long, you know, you read about the histories of Greenwich Village, and it's as though the village was created by like gay white guys who were all like publishing geniuses. And I'm like, there were about 5 of them, you know, and the village was a little bigger than that. So who are the rest of these people? And why aren't these stories told, right? And what does that ramification have for us today, do you know? And so that's, I think, a lot of what I am always trying to do. So what I'm working on, like, right now, separate from those other projects, is a podcast about queer identity. Like, how did we come up with this world of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans? How is that world now changing? Sort of looking at like sexuality, like so often I feel like gay people are removed from history entirely. Either we're not talked about, or it's like we were exactly the same everywhere and every when. We're not allowed to develop, we do not change, we live outside of time, right? And I think that that does a disservice to all of us, and also to straight people, who I'm much less interested in, but I do think that they can get something from my work as well. But that's, for me, what I'm always trying to do, and I'm hoping that I will help someone to understand the conditions of the world we live in through understanding the past.
Thank you, everybody.